Hey guys, welcome back to the Wingspan Podcast episode 2. I'm Chris Mahan of Nets Daily, joined by my co-host Doug Barrick and our special guest. Our first guest is one of the most well-known writers for HoopsHype and USA Today Sports. He is also the podcast host of the HoopsHype Podcast, where he brings you in-depth interviews with NBA players, executives, coaches, and agents, giving listeners a behind-the-scenes look at the association. He has recorded a total of 160 podcasts at the time of this recording, and he has over 178,000 Twitter followers. We are joined by Alex Kennedy.
Welcome to the Wingspan Podcast, Alex. Thank you for taking some time out of your day and night to join Chris and I. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks, guys. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And then I guess the first question we kind of start off with, we talked a little bit off air about it. But can you just talk a little bit about your journey to where you got to where you are today, kind of what college you went to, where were you born, raised, and kind of your first sports media position or your internship, how you got involved in the field?
Yeah, for sure. So I was born in New Jersey, and then after a few months moved to Florida. So I really grew up in Florida, and I kind of have a strange journey. I always loved sports. I played sports a lot growing up, and then I started writing when I was 14 years old. I started writing for different message boards, and then I got a job at Real GM at 14, and I I always tell people, I kind of had a strange past. I loved sports when I was younger. I played sports, and then when I was 12 years old, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. So I think, and I stopped playing basketball, football. I think I realized at a younger age than most people, okay, I'm not going to be able to play professional sports. I had that, that realistic, mindset earlier than most people. But I knew I wanted to stick around sports somehow and have a career in sports. So I thought, okay, what can I do? Can I coach? Journalism, and I really loved writing. So I thought, okay, it'd be cool to get to know these athletes and tell their stories. So, at 14, I was doing, different articles and things like that. Real GM hired me. And when I was about 15 years old, I reached out to the Orlando Magic PR department and basically said, hey, I'm 15 years old. I would love to someday become a sports writer. Is it possible for me to come cover a practice or anything like that? And they basically said, we can bring you to a game. You have to bring a chaperone. So my dad would actually come with me to games that first year because I was a kid, and I was actually 14 when I covered my first game, and then 15 when I got my first full season credential. But that first year, they would basically just give me, credentials to games that, the main sports writers didn't want to go to. The bad games, the small market teams that came in. If it was a holiday game and everyone else was home with their family, I could go cover that game. And for me, it was so much fun. I would have paid money to have a ticket and be at the game. So the thought of getting in for free and being able to go in the locker rooms and meet the players and everything, it was so cool for me as a kid. And then I just kept doing that for a few different years. Would do interviews at the games with the players and coaches and things like that. And everyone was so nice to me. That was when the Magic were pretty bad. They had just traded Tracy McGrady, and they had Steve Francis. It was Dwight Howard's rookie year, and guys like Steve Francis, Jameer Nelson, they were so friendly and helpful. I always say Steve Francis, he would pull me to the side after the media scrum and say, hey man, did you get all your questions in? Can I answer anything for you? Just super friendly, because he knew I was kind of shy and just kind of taking everything in as a kid. So after a few years, my work got noticed by Basketball Insider's publisher, Steve Kyler, and he hired me. So at 18 years old, I was a freshman at the University of South Florida, and he hired me to become a full-time writer over at Basketball Insiders. And then eventually I moved my way up over there to managing editor. And then the last few years, 3 years ago, HoopsHype hired me away. So now I'm a writer and podcast host for HoopsHype and USA Today Sports.
That's awesome, man.
That's awesome. And I got to ask you, obviously, a lot of people don't have that kind of journey that you had. Obviously, you have a lot of inspiration behind your past, your story, what you've been diagnosed with at a young age. But I got to tell you, it's truly inspirational, obviously, as a reporter myself here, and kind of the journey you've taken. Obviously, for me, as we talked a little bit off air, I've started, as in college, I've started gaining a lot of writing experience. So I know what it's like to kind of have that kind of hustle and that kind of drive to get to where you want it to go. But I got to ask you, obviously, you started covering games, like you said, at 14, 15 years old. Kind of what obviously back then you probably didn't have that full, you didn't really digest everything at once. but kind of what was that like for other media members to kind of see a 14, 15-year-old kid? And did you ever get to talk to any of those media guys? And kind of what did they think of the whole thing off the base of your memory?
Yeah, that's a great question. There were some guys that were super friendly and welcoming and helpful. Guys like Brian Schmitz from the Orlando Sentinel, John Denton, who was a beat writer. Now he works for OrlandoMagic.com. There were these people. Jared Rudolph was amazing. He was the guy that eventually wrote for Real GM later on, and now he works in PR with players. There were certain guys that I think they could see that I was just trying to learn, and that I didn't really know what I was doing, obviously, as a kid. So they were really helpful and welcoming and friendly. And then there were you could tell there were some writers that were kind of just like, why is this kid here?
Yeah,
I don't
exactly.
necessarily blame them. I was 14 years old, and I'm sure they're thinking, look, I'm trying to do my job. I think it helped that I wasn't really getting in the way. I was never the one that was, hogging the mic during press conferences or asking stupid questions during scrums, like that. I tried to really just kind of blend in and learn from my surroundings and not necessarily be obnoxious and, compete with them too much. At least for that first, year or two, I just tried to kind of learn from watching what they did. And then, eventually I was able to build the confidence to ask questions and things like that. But I tried not to get in the way of them doing their work. So I think they appreciated that, but there were definitely some questions like, why is this guy here? And I get that.
Yeah. Oh, of course. And I feel like and then another question I got to ask too is, do you ever talk to any of those players anymore, like Steve Francis or any of those guys that you mentioned, and like kind of say, hey, like I was that 15-year-old kid back then, like, or did you ever get to talk to them at all recently, or kind of bring up the fact? Yeah.
Steve Francis followed me on Twitter, and I reached out to him and said, hey, I want to thank you for being so friendly and helpful whenever I was a kid coming up. And he had no idea that was me. And we're just following because I think a lot of players read HoopsHype. I've learned, executives read it and stuff. So I think he was just following because he likes HoopsHype or saw a certain article or something like that. So it was a coincidence. And then when I reached out to him, he was like, oh, man, I had no idea. And then, was basically just was kind of shocked to learn that. So I have had an opportunity to thank him. I've shouted out certain guys that were super friendly that year. I remember Grant Hill, Tim Duncan. There were certain guys that, as they were coming off the floor from shoot around, they would, pull me to the side and let me ask questions to them and kind of do one-on-one interviews. So there's certain guys that I've definitely thanked over the years just for the way they were, so gracious and the way they kind of helped me. It was great. I think early on, a lot of them were thinking, okay, this is a kid, I should help him out. And then by the time I was, 18, 19, I realized, hey, I'm closer in age to a lot of these players than the reporters. And then it almost became an advantage because I could bond with these guys and relate to them.
Exactly, because that's exactly how kind of I feel in some situations. Right now, my main role is to cover the Long Island Nets, and a lot of these guys are fresh out of college or kind of came out of college a couple years earlier, so they're around my age. I'm 21 years old, so a lot of these guys are my age.
Right.
And when I talk to these guys, I could tell that compared to some older media members, guys in their 30s, 40s, even 50s, that they're more conversational with me. They're able to talk about stuff, not just about Long Island Nets, but they could talk about life. Some players have came up to me, oh, you're in college? Oh, where do you go to college? Like kind of asking about my background, what I do. So I understand that point of view, like you brought up, kind of having that connection, being in that same age bracket and having those kind of talks.
Yeah, it really worked well with the players. They responded really well when I was, around 19, 20, 21, just because I think, like you said, we were listening to the same music, doing the same things. Me versus a 50-year-old that they can't really relate to, I think it did help. And I think that after that, it was just, at that point, I started breaking some news, which I don't really do as much of anymore. I think it's so stressful. And I'd rather do more of the long forms and podcasts and behind the scenes type stuff rather than just chasing that. I have so much respect for the guys that do it, but it is stressful. So, but at that point, I started breaking some news and talking to a lot of agents and executives and a lot of players. And one thing that was hard was, being 19 years old, 20 years old, immediately you almost have to prove yourself. And, everyone enters the conversation or reads your report and immediately doubts it because of your age. And I would experience that a lot. And then once I was in my mid-20s, I realized, okay, now that I've kind of proven myself a bit, and now that I'm not, a teenager, people tend to take me more seriously. I've known, executives and agents who will now respond quicker and be more helpful because of my age. So while it helped with the players, I would say early on it did kind of hurt with the executives and agents, and then also the readers.
Exactly.
So, Alex,
Exactly.
what was the first story that you broke, if you can remember?
I want to say it was CJ Watson. I believe I think he signed the qualifying offer when he was with the Warriors. And, I was talking to people in his camp a lot and I was able to confirm it and stuff. So I think that may have been the first one. We ran it with Real GM. I remember, though, that summer, I was really interested in free agency. And even now, I mean, one of the reasons why HoopsHype and I are such a good fit together is because I'm obsessed with transactions and contracts and that kind of stuff. So
I
I've
mean, there's
always
been a lot this summer, that's for sure.
yeah. I love player movement and I love, rumors and all that. That's what HoopsHype's all about. So, but I remember one summer I put together, a Word document with every single free agent, every single, all of their agents, and then the agent's contact number, and basically write down any phone number, I could find for that agent, or someone that worked with the agent. And then, I would just cold call these agents. And then eventually I was able to develop a lot of relationships with the agents. You meet a lot of them at places like Summer League or the Combine, and that helps as well. And then from there, it just becomes easier and easier to kind of break news and, meet these people because, you gain their trust. And, obviously they have an agenda sometimes too when they try to tell you something. So, you just kind of develop those relationships, and that's what I was able to do.
Yeah, perfect. And then I got to ask you as well. On top of that, to kind of just backtrack a little bit, I know you covered it a little bit when you were talking about your past and everything, but kind of after your diagnosis, kind of what kind of made you realize that you kind of wanted to pursue a career in sports rather than obviously you mentioned that like, your diagnosis you couldn't necessarily participate in a lot of sports, but kind of what was that thing in your mind like you know what I would kind of want to pursue a career in sports. And at that time, obviously you mentioned that you were at a very young age kind of what was your parents kind of thinking when you started talking about, hey, I got invited to this game or, hey, I got invited to these kind of events? Kind of what were they thinking? Because at least from my point of view, if I was 14, 15 years old and I told my dad, hey, I got an invitation to this, hey, I got credentials to this, he would be blown away. He would doubt me obviously at that age, but kind of you just talk a little about like when did you realize that kind of when did you want to pursue a career in sports?
Yeah, I've always been a big believer that you should do something that you're passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like, if you're doing something, I love sports. Again, I was a huge football fan, a huge basketball fan. And I thought, if I end up working this job, then, I'm never going to feel like I worked a day in my life because I'll be able to just get paid to watch sports and write about them and talk to these athletes. So that was kind of the reason why I think, I kind of got lucky too. A lot of people have a career they have in mind at 13, 14 years old, and they don't end up doing that. I'm lucky that the career that I wanted was something that worked out, and I was able to, eventually get that career. And, it's really worked out with my health situation too, working from home and having flexible hours and things like that. I really picked a career that was perfect for my situation. And that was a little bit of luck too. So I'm really happy with the way it played out. But yeah, I mean, my parents initially, I remember they were thinking, my mom was like, don't get your hopes up. I really don't want you to think you're going to be able to get credentialed to a game or anything like that. And then I remember at Real GM, the reason I reached out to the Magic is because we had a writer, I forget his name, but he got credentialed for a Golden State Warriors game. And I remember specifically, he did an interview with Speedy Claxton. This was before the Warriors were really good.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, if he could get there from, obviously he was credentialed through Real GM, the exact same place that I'm writing right now. What's stopping me from trying? So I reached out, and then, yeah, whenever they said, you need a chaperone, I told my dad, and he was thinking, okay, so I'm going to get to go in the locker room of an NBA game. Like, he was kind of blown away at first too. And then, we lived in Tampa at the time. Now I don't, but we had to drive to Orlando, which is like an hour and a half drive too. So I always say, my dad was super helpful, driving an hour and a half there, hour and a half back to make sure I could cover these games and get that experience. So it was great. I was so lucky with, so many different things worked out for me to get in this position today.
That's great, man. I got to give it to you. That's a lot. That, like you said, that like a lot of guys that like me and you back then, to especially be in this field, you got to have like that drive. Even though I know when I was first started writing, I started writing for Elite Sports New York when I was about 18, 19 years old at that time. And I remember she's my college advisor now. Her name's Kelly Whiteside. She writes for the New York Times as a contributor, and she's been sure for Sports Illustrated, USA Today in the past. And the biggest thing she told me, and same thing with Philip Bondi, because those are two of my biggest mentors there are. And they said, always keep it in the back of your mind that even if you don't think people are watching, people are watching.
Right. Yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, I think early on too, it was kind of like, okay, even when I emailed the Magic, what I said was, hey, I'm not sure if I want to be a sports writer, but I kind of want to try it out and see if this is the path I want to go down. So I think that was part of it too, just kind of getting in the job and seeing what it was like and experiencing it. And then from there, knowing, okay, am I good enough to do this? Is it something I really want to pursue? I was able to kind of learn on the fly and figure out if this is the path I want to go down. And then sure enough, I remember that covering that first game. I was there interviewing these players. Jameer Nelson was my first ever interview, and he was so friendly and helpful and everything. And he was joking with me, and he's like, "Are they paying you? I need to be your agent. They're not. If they're not paying you because you're a kid, that's not cool. They need to call me. I'm your agent now." And just so friendly and helpful. And then, yeah, I mean, I was like, okay, this is amazing. This is like being a sports fan, but you get unprecedented access, and it was so cool. So I try to keep that same passion and not take this for granted, because over the years I've seen a lot of reporters and stuff that are jaded and take it for granted that they get to cover games and talk to athletes for a living. So I try to keep that same perspective.
And with all the clout going around, it's definitely a common thing. We've seen it all the time. So we're glad to have someone as authentic as you, man. And I
Thank you.
gotta ask, like, all these guys, Steve Francis, Jameer Nelson, like, how often do you get to talk to them? Like, reliving those days. I guess technically speaking, they were your glory days from the get go. But like looking at it back at it now, like when you reconnected with Steve, and it's like, yo, I was that kid back then. How many moments have you had like that from like looking back, like pretty practically a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, and reliving that moment with them?
Yeah, it's really fun to reminisce. And I think someone like Steve, I always say this too. He was an all-star that year, and he was, the best player on the team. He hit a number of game-winning shots. He did not have to go out of his way to help a 14-year-old. Like, there was no ulterior motive there. He wasn't trying to do it for press. He was doing it because he was friendly. And, all the guys in that locker room were that same way. So I think, it says a lot about those people, because I could not do anything to help them at the time. I think how you treat people that can't help you or advance your career, or get you any money, I think that says a lot. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely respect those guys, and I thank them often.
That's great to hear, man. And then I got to ask you as well, is kind of what obviously, like you mentioned already a couple times, you've covered this team, or you started covering NBA basketball at such a young age. But do you remember kind of when you started to begin to watch the NBA, and what your first memory was as a fan perspective point of view, and what kind of your favorite team growing up, and kind of everything just along those lines, kind of as a fan perspective?
Yeah, I would say, my whole family loves sports. And I think it's part of the reason why, too, I was so attracted to the job. I was a huge Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan, still am. My family loves the Bucks, so they were huge football fans, and that kind of was the first thing that happened. I was a Bucks fan for as long as I can remember. And then, I had some friends at school, and we all started watching the Orlando Magic and Tracy McGrady. And then, I fell in love with some of those teams. So, now I really don't have a favorite NBA team. I've tried to be objective, and now I kind of root more for players in certain situations, because I want to see them do well and get paid, just because, I've got a chance to kind of know some of them and their families and everything. So I don't really have a favorite team now, but back in the day, I was a big Magic fan, big T-Mac fan.
I feel that because I tell my friends that all the time, because obviously they see me and they're going into different fields. And like I said before, I'm still in college, and all these guys are like, "Oh wow, you have such a great job. You get to talk to these players." But what, like, are you a fan of like a certain team, or are you a Nets fan because you cover the team? You're from New Jersey. I remember you going to a lot of games growing up, and I have the same point of view. Like nowadays, being a writer, being a reporter, and kind of being in this field at such a young age, as kind of, at least from my perspective, you don't lose that fan aspect of rooting for that team that you rooted for such a long time, but instead, after you kind of build the relationships with inside that organization, talking to the players, you kind of take that aspect. You start rooting for specific players. You want to see them get paid. You want to see them become an all-star, and you get to, like, inside conversations. As long as you have a good relationship with them, you know what kind of they're aiming to get. And when you see them kind of achieve that goal, you feel good about them, or you feel good for them. So I know exactly that kind of mindset that you had going in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things too, I think because I started covering games so young, at 14, you kind of see everyone and you hear all the rules, like, no clapping or cheering in the press box, and you have to be very objective. So I think, it knocked the fandom out of me. It's like, okay, I really need to follow these rules, or else, I already felt weird enough, like the outsider that was bothering people. If I wasn't following the rules, I felt like I was just going to be, I feel like I wouldn't be invited back. So I think I learned those things really early on. But yeah, I mean, with the players though, you definitely want to see them do well. I think for me too, I've started. One thing I've realized is if you start connecting with guys when they're really young, I start talking to some of these guys when they're in high school or they're in college. So they're just trying to get to college basketball sometimes, or they're trying to make it to the NBA. So when you see those guys, 10 years later finally get a huge contract or become an all-star, and you've kind of been there since the very beginning, I think that's really cool. And these guys are loyal. They really appreciate it too whenever you've been around before everyone else. If you start talking to a guy after he becomes an all-star, they sense that. They know you're just trying to get something out of them and use them. But when you were talking to them when they were 16 years old, 17 years old, you've kind of helped them and been there for the long haul. They appreciate that.
Exactly. And then I got to ask you as well, obviously, the field kind of just transition a little bit and kind of get into a different avenue of discussion.
Sure.
Obviously, the field of sports journalism is obviously massively changing. Like back then when I was a kid, and same thing with you at your young age, a lot of the beat writers nowadays were people that were in newspapers. So, for example, in this area, New York Post, The Times, Daily News. But nowadays you see guys on a lot of digital media platforms, such as me for like Nets Daily, Real GM, like you at HoopsHype, and kind of other platforms. So can I just get your kind of perspective? Obviously, you've been in the field for a little over a decade now, and kind of where do you see, and can you just talk a little bit about when you started to realize that transition of how sports journalism was kind of heading, and where do you see it kind of heading in the future?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I've kind of been there and watched the progression. When I was at Basketball Insiders, before it was Basketball Insiders, there was a website called Hoops World, and the whole staff moved over and joined Basketball Insiders. But I remember the Lakers had a rule that if you were from an online publication, they wouldn't credential you. That was kind of the big rule they had. Yeah. So we had Hoops World started a magazine called Swish Magazine, and part of it was because we wanted to launch a magazine and we wanted to have readers that could kind of read us not only online but in the magazine. But a big part of that was so that we could submit credentials to teams like the Lakers, the Chicago Bulls, and say, hey, we're a print publication too. And then sure enough, whenever we did that, we were able to get in the building. So we kind of had to figure things out a little bit there. Now, like you said, Adrian Wojnarowski, Sham Charania, Chris Haynes, some of the biggest writers right now work for online publications. And, I always say this too, I have a ton of respect for the newspaper guys and the beat writers and what they do, but, that was never a job I really wanted. I always wanted to be, working for one of these big websites. So from the very beginning, going to Basketball Insiders and now going to HoopsHype and everything, I've always kind of just wanted to stay with the website. So it's been really interesting to kind of watch the transformation. I think the newspaper guys still do a fantastic job, but it's just changed so much.
Exactly. Well, I remember with Basketball Insiders, that's when I started following you back when I think you were working with Cody, I believe, in Basketball Insiders.
Yeah.
So that's when I started following you guys, and it was just a great experience. And then seeing your progression with all the different segments you use. One of them we'll be talking about just a moment is your podcast, but I loved all the trivia type things you do, the slideshow forms of, facts of trying to guess in games. It's just a fun interaction with the fans. I mean, one thing I got to ask you, and though I feel like the answer at the moment is still no, but do you see NBA media journalism go towards TikTok at all? Or do you think it'll be more with the live stream on Instagram and Twitter kind of thing?
I don't think it goes to TikTok. I think, with Vine, we kind of saw highlights and things like that on there, but it's just so hard when you have limited number of seconds and
of course
such a younger audience too. I think it's really hard to appeal to that audience unless you really know what you're doing. So, but I do think, you have to be able to diversify. I feel like that's kind of the direction that we're going, to answer your other question. I feel like back in the day, you could just be a writer, and those days are long gone. Now you need to be able to be on camera and do a podcast and shoot videos and be really good at social media. I remember one of the first things I remember when I was covering the Magic back in the day. There was this big debate in the media room because not only were the writers having to submit their articles to the newspaper, they had to write these blogs, and it was like, what are these blog things? Why are we doing this? We're giving them extra content.
You're living through the golden age.
Yeah, it was like, this is the direction that, we're moving, and online is becoming more important. And they were just, so upset about having to just write some stuff for the website in addition to the newspaper. So,
you know what they say about that now? Okay, millennial.
Yeah. The job has just changed so much, but I just think you have to be able to do so many different things now. You have to be able to, um, contribute content in a number of different areas. The videos that you mentioned are one area where I try to, help out with HoopsHype.
I
And
love
this,
it so much.
yeah, they're fun. I like doing them too. I think it's a cool way to kind of put together stats and information. So I think that's kind of the area where we're heading. You have to be able to write, obviously, but you have to do a whole lot more too.
Exactly. And then to stay in the same kind of avenue of social media, obviously, since social media started to blow up in around 2007, 2008, but even nowadays, I see that social media gives a lot of people, I highlighted this in my book that's coming out, that the power of social media is really giving fans around the world a kind of a special type of relationship to have with players. Obviously, you could, if a player tweets out something, you could comment on that. And sometimes the players will see it, sometimes they don't, depending on their personal preference. But can you see, obviously, from since we're both writers and reporters, I see that obviously social media has been a very big influence in relationships to having with fans and athletes of mostly all major sports across the world. So can you just talk a little about kind of how you see social media being a benefit in the kind of the field of sports journalism and kind of as the fan aspect?
Yeah, for sure. I think, it's huge. Honestly, most of the players that I have strong relationships with, I've met them on social media. And,
Yeah.
even the guys I mentioned that, I started getting to know when they were in high school or college, oftentimes, I'd follow them, we'd start DMing, and then I'd see them at a game in person, and then that kind of built the relationship. But yeah, social media is huge to gain relationships and get to know players. For reporters and fans, it's been so cool. I think also for players, for a long time, they had to just trust the media to put out, their quotes and kind of shape the narrative. But now they have a direct link to the fans and everyone, so they're able to kind of control the narrative a bit with, Twitter, Instagram, and
Yeah, it's so mutually beneficial for everyone.
right. It really is. I like it a lot. One thing that I used to do was while I was still at Hoops World back in the day, I was a ghostwriter for a number of players for their personal websites, which was really cool.
Really?
Yeah, so that
Wow.
was kind of that was one of the first. A lot of these guys had their own websites where they sold merchandise and did Q&As and things like
Are
that.
you
So
allowed to reveal who they were, or are we still off the record too
no,
soon?
I think Aaron Brooks was one of them. There were a few guys. Aaron Brooks was the one that I wrote the most for, though. Basically, and the stuff was, really Aaron's thoughts. What we would do is we'd get on the phone and talk for about 20 minutes. He'd give me updates about, their recent road trip and what happened on and off the court and all that. And then I'd put it into, 1,000-word blog. And then, it basically was posted on the website under his blog so we could connect with fans. So I think, a lot of these guys get it and they understand the need to connect with fans. The guys that don't, I think they're kind of missing out. There's so much benefit to doing that. There's certain guys that just have their PR people run their Twitter account, Instagram, or they just don't even have one. And I think that's, they're really missing out. But yeah, I think it's huge for them to connect with fans. And then again, as a reporter, I've benefited so much. CJ Watson, the guy I mentioned, my first story I broke, we met on Twitter. So there's been so much that's come from Twitter. I don't think I'd be here today in this position if it wasn't for Twitter and social media as a whole.
It's so great that stigmatism about meeting people online has really gotten better. I know,
Yeah.
the whole jokes of online dating stuff. Well, this is the equivalent of that. This is, sports dating, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
So it's great. I mean, that's how I befriended you. I befriended Chris. I befriended some NBA players, some of which will thankfully be on our upcoming pod, some of which you thankfully know, one of whom can't say when, but you recently put on your podcast. So jumping back to your pod, when did you first begin to host the HoopsHype podcast, and what was your inspiration behind launching it?
Yeah, I think it was a year and a half ago. Basically, we were doing the articles. I was doing a lot of long form articles for HoopsHype, and then I would do Q&As where I would talk to a player. We'd post the interview. And I was really enjoying doing that. I was also doing some videos for USA Today and things like that. But I wanted to contribute more. And I figured, podcasts are blowing up. And I would get emails sometimes from PR people and agents and things like that. And they would ask, could you do a podcast interview with our player? And I'm like, I don't have a podcast, but we could do a Q&A. And I think it's because podcasts have really blown up and gotten so big. There's this desire for long form conversations, not only from fans and, I love them obviously, but from PR people and agents as well. I think, again, going back to connecting directly with fans, I think players and coaches and executives, I think they realize, you can really, show people who you are if you sit down and have an hour-long conversation, and people get to kind of know you better and understand, the way you think. It really can help your perception a bit too. So, that was kind of the inspiration. I wanted to be able to do some more interviews. Early on, we were kind of finding our footing, and we had some big guests early on. Our first few guests were John Wall, CJ McCollum, but the audio quality was so bad. I look back at those podcasts and I cringe. We've gotten so much better over the year.
Pretty good backcourt.
Yeah, I wasn't on your guys' level where my first 2 episodes were on this quality, this level. So I'm jealous. We we really struggled early on trying to figure it out. Now, I have a good mic and we have a pretty good setup. But it's been great. I think, again, I've realized since I started kind of hosting this too, in addition to being at games and talking to people, you realize just, the reach that HoopsHype has. And I was a HoopsHype reader long before I started, writing there and working there. I've loved HoopsHype for years. I would go there for my rumors. It's everything's in one spot. So, I've always really liked HoopsHype, but now I'm realizing how many players and executives check it religiously as well. And that's allowed us to get some really cool guests over the year and a half.
Exactly. I could relate on that in so many ways because I've been reading HoopsHype for a long time, and I obviously see the content that not only the writing department even like produces, but even like the same guests that you have on podcasts. But I kind of want to backtrack a little bit with the kind of the relationship with players as a broad point of view. Obviously, as reporters and even fans nowadays, you've seen kind of over time the relationship between athletes and media have been strained as of late. Obviously, I've heard from a lot of journalists, older guys like my mentors I've mentioned earlier, that there's always going to be 3 types of athletes. There's going to be athletes that love the media. There's going to be the athletes that respect that that the media's do it, that they're supposed to do a job, that that they interviewed them because it's a job. We're all supposed to be doing jobs. And the third group of guys, are people that kind of just do not like doing the media.
Right.
But do you kind of see that those kind of 3 categories of the media, and can you just talk a little about obviously your experience with talking with athletes, and have you ever do you agree with that kind of point that the transition over time with players and media has been somewhat strained, and nowadays it's kind of a serious talking point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely those 3 groups. I think that's great advice. Your mentors are right. I've seen it throughout the NBA. There are some guys that love doing interviews and love the media and will get close to guys and build relationships. There are those guys in the middle that, they're going to tolerate you because they know you're just trying to do your job, and, they're respectful, and, you're not going to get close to those guys, but they're going to help you in the moment, maybe give you a good quote. And then there's the guys that usually I think those third group of guys, typically they're the ones that I feel like have been either, there's been negative coverage of them, or they've been in a really big market where, I feel like some guys go to New York, for example, on the Knicks, and there's coverage about their personal life or really like just critical commentary on them. And
like Fortnite from last year.
Yeah, I think they hold it against the rest of the, media and think, okay, media has ruined my life, or they've really stressed me out. Or like, there's certain guys that slip in the draft and, they were really low in mock drafts and they feel like the media is out to get them. So I think I've seen that as well, where, they just hold a grudge against the media over time. I think now, for those players, I think they have outlets. They can go to the Players Tribune, and again, they can reach fans and stuff on their own with their own social media platforms. So they don't necessarily need the media as much. But I think typically most guys fall into the first 2 categories and are pretty friendly and helpful. That's my experience, at least. There have been some guys over the years that have been super grumpy and made your job difficult. But one of the things, I mentioned Steve Kyler, the publisher at Basketball Insiders. He had been covering the league for 15 years by the time he hired me. So, and I would go to games. He's based out of Orlando as well. So when we'd go to games, he'd kind of tell me who's who and, maybe avoid that player because he'll give you 1-word answers or make your life difficult. So I kind of learned which players to avoid and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Cause you hit it right on the nail right there. I completely agree with your point right there. And I would kind of have to say, obviously, throughout that span of just the history of things, how do you, like you talked about, that these athletes, the ones that may have had their words twisted in the past and kind of have lost that trust of media, unless, like you've said, like with your past, obviously with my experience as well, I've gotten to talk to guys that when they were in college and now they're in the pros, and you build that relationship. That's where relationships become valuable. But how do you feel personally about kind of LeBron and Maverick Carter's Uninterrupted, where it gives athletes the platform to kind of put out their own work without having a fear of their own words twisted? And same thing with the Players Tribune. What's kind of your opinion on those type of platforms that kind of give athletes that comfortable pillow to know that they know, oh, I could talk about something that's very personal or it's mostly just very personal to them, and
I love it. I really do. I know, some journalists are threatened by it, and I understand where they're coming from. They feel like eventually all guys will just go to Uninterrupted or the Players Tribune, and then, that we won't have jobs anymore. So I understand why some people feel threatened by it, but I feel like it's just different. I feel like there's always going to be a need for objective journalism. I feel like in those cases, I like the fact that they can go on uninterrupted and have a completely different conversation than I would have with the player. I think it's a way for players to talk to players. I say that too about, you see now there are a lot of players that are starting up podcasts like CJ McCollum. I know Quentin Richardson and Darius Miles have a podcast. That conversation, player to player, is going to be so different than anything that, I can get out of
players only, baby. Players only.
Yeah. I just feel like they're able to relate and, tell stories from when they play together and everything. So I like it because I feel like the content they're getting is different from anything that I'm trying to get out of a player when I'm sitting down to interview them. So I don't necessarily feel threatened by it. I think it's a great addition on top of everything else because, at the end of the day, I think if a fan reads something really interesting on Players Tribune, that doesn't mean they're not going to read any other website for the day or anything like that. I think it has its place, and I think it's a good addition on top of all other journalism. I don't think it should replace journalism and everything like that. I just think it's so different and unique that I don't think it's going to threaten the coverage or the objective journalism that everyone else is doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So, Alex, I got two questions that you brought up. Good points. One led on to the three types of media and the players. One is about the mental health. And then the other one pretty much has to do with how it's been impacting that everyone needs these different perspectives. There's the media perspective, fan perspective, the player perspective. And some of these things get taken out of context. And this is a small example, like with Jared Dudley and Ben Simmons during the playoffs. He's He's an average player, half court kind of thing. But if you read the full court, I'm sorry, not the full court, because that was obviously the point he was making. If you read the full quote, you really get a different sense of what Dudley was trying to do. But unfortunately, whether it's for the fans, for the media, for the other players, to fire each other up, and that kind of thing intermixes with the mental health of things, of how people's words get taken out of context, and then they just feel like closing up they don't want to talk. So they're really burying themselves because they don't feel comfortable. Like they always feel like they have a straitjacket on instead of wearing, a metaphorical sweatpants per se.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's really important to have context. I think that's one of the issues with something like Twitter, where, or even like Instagram, you see sometimes they'll pull a quote out from a larger story or even a larger quote, and they'll just run, one little thing and, it spreads one little sentence or two sentences. I think it's really important to have that context. And I think that's why, at HoopsHype, for example, we have the rumors page where we try to aggregate, all the different news and reports from a day. And we always try to include that context. I think that's really important because otherwise, guys will get frustrated. If you're taking their words out of context and, stirring the pot, they're going to get frustrated if you're using their words to do that. But I do think, you mentioned the mental health aspect of things. One thing I've tried to do at HoopsHype with my behind the scenes articles is kind of show that perspective. What's it like when you're receiving social media criticism? One article we've done that I've enjoyed was talking to players about being labeled overpaid or being labeled a cancer by the media and fans. I think a lot of times people don't think of that, what the players are going through. And a lot of times I know fans will say, look, that guy's getting paid millions of dollars. That comes with the job. Toughen up. And I get that mentality from fans. These guys get paid the big bucks, but it doesn't mean they don't have issues. And, they're people too. So that's kind of one of the things I've tried to show. And, not only just with players too, we've tried to show, I did an article that looked at the behind the scenes life of assistant coaches. And that kind of looked at, all the different sacrifices they make and how hard that job can be. Executives as well, they get so
and agents, I believe, with the free agency and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So we've tried to show, what it's like to work those jobs, not only just be a player, but an agent and an assistant coach, an executive, and kind of everything that comes with that, good and bad. And that's always kind of my goal, to show the mental health side of things too.
And then, Alex, I got to ask you as well to kind of just touch back on and get a little bit off topic with the field of sports journalism. Obviously, from my personal experience, like I said, I'm still in college. And my major right now is television digital media with a concentration in sports media and journalism. And when I talk to a lot of guys that are in my class, you'd be surprised, and a lot of people wouldn't be surprised at the same time. It's kind of a mixed feeling. But a lot of kids nowadays, they say, "Oh wow, like Chris, you do a lot," or "Hey Chris, like you have a lot going for yourself," and they kind of feel dismotivated to kind of continue to pursue to become a writer and reporter and do what you do and do what a lot of other columnists and beat writers and everyone do. Do you kind of feel that same approach, and do you feel like the next generation of sports media is kind of feeling kind of dismotivated to continue in that field? Because nowadays, sports media in this field, it's one of the toughest and most competitive fields to get into, especially with kids out of college.
Yeah, it's difficult. I definitely, I remember when I was in college, we had professors that were saying, why are you even pursuing this? You need to just change your major. And they were trying to, I know they had good intentions. I think they had bad experiences and they were trying to warn others. But I think what it does is it creates a lot of negativity. So a lot of these students feel hopeless. And you see, when you have that kind of negativity, and then you also see, tons of layoffs, and every few months, it feels like there's a new big story where, Sports Illustrated lays off tons of people, or these big companies, not even just smaller blogs, but these big companies that you think are, at the top of the industry, they're laying off people and seemingly struggling. So it does lead to that. I think it does frustrate people, and you think, okay, what shot do I have? But I think I would just say, there are so many jobs that you don't even know exist yet. And it's not just, writing jobs, but there's jobs in TV, jobs in radio, jobs in PR. I think that's one thing that I've really been able to learn. And, you interact with so many different people from different jobs. I would say, keep doing what you're doing. Try to work extremely hard. And, I would say, too, try to meet the right people, because so much of this is who you know. That relationships are so important in getting those jobs, because, you can be the most talented person in the world, but at the end of the day, if no one, sees that talent, then you're not going to get the break you need to, get one of those jobs. So I would just say, try again, diversify, try to learn to do everything, right? Be on camera, be behind the camera, do podcasts, learn how to edit podcasts, look at radio, TV, again, PR and marketing. There's tons of jobs there. I've seen people, go from struggling in journalism to being able to get a 6-figure job, in that industry. And I know that's a little bit of a pivot and not necessarily doing maybe what you thought you'd be doing, but I would just say there's way more jobs out there than maybe you imagine. And I think it's not as bleak as some people make it sound. So it's easy to get discouraged, and certainly I've been there too. There were times whenever I was in college, and even I was working my full-time job, but getting paid very little and trying to balance that with school and paying the bills and everything, and it's stressful. But I think if you can meet the right people and diversify, you should be okay.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, exactly. Because I could really relate that, like how you talked about your college experience. I could relate to that as well. And then kind of just transition. Obviously, you joined us on the Wingspan Podcast, and obviously you have your own podcast, the HoopsHype Podcast. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of the trend of podcasts and kind of how that's becoming a new trend? Not only in sports, you see it with every type of genre, from culture, fashion, you name it, in any industry. Podcasts are becoming a big thing. You see Dr. Phil with his own podcast. You see a lot of these guys, even regular guys just in college, just having a podcast about literally anything of their own interest.
Pretty much a podcast on podcast is even a thing.
Podcast on podcast. It could literally be that. But can you just talk about, obviously, from your experiences, can you just talk a little about kind of what you have seen in the rise of podcasts, and why do you believe podcasts are becoming so popular nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always kind of prided myself on being able to find that next thing that people are going to latch onto. That's where I feel like I was on Twitter really early, and that really benefited me. Back in college, me and my buddy, I mean, podcasting wasn't really big then or easy to do, but, we had a show on Blog Talk Radio, I think it's called. We've always tried to do things like that to gain experience and, appeal to a lot of different people. And there are a lot of people out there that want to hear about NBA coverage, or again, hear about anything. There's a podcast about anything at this point. But, you sitting down to read a 3,000 word article takes a lot of time. You have to focus on it. Whereas, if you're doing the dishes or driving or things like that, you want to be able to just throw a podcast on. And for a long time, I did podcasts, but I didn't listen to them. Now, I haven't listened to the radio in so long. I only listen to podcasts now. I really, I've bought into the hype, and I listen now.
You are the hype. You are the hype, man.
The hoops hype. No, I listen now in addition to doing one, and I listen to the Joe Budden podcast. I listen to different NBA podcasts. I love the fantasy football podcast out there. There are just so many podcasts that I really enjoy listening to, and I totally get it now. Because there's tons of times where it doesn't make sense to be able to read an article, but you can sit down for a 45-minute podcast when you're driving or doing housework or things like that. So I think it just reaches a different group of people. There are people that read the articles and listen to podcasts, so I try not to duplicate what we're doing on the site and with articles and interviews on the site with what we're doing on the podcast, because I know it's some of the same people, but I do think it's a different audience that you can reach. And that's the same thing with videos too. We do a lot of videos for HoopsHype and USA Today, and those are a completely different audience as well. So I think it's just getting those people that don't read articles. And there's tons of people out there that love podcasts. I've really learned that.
This podcast episode is brought to you by Anchor. Anchor is an app that allows podcast producers to record and create original content. It is free to record and create a podcast, giving producers the ability to easily edit their material off their phone or computer. Anchor allows producers and talent to make money off their work with no minimum listenership. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you on platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and many more. To get started, Anchor app or go to anchor.fm. Anchor for Doug and I has been great and allows us to bring unique, creative, and opinionated content to listeners of the Wingspan Podcast. Yeah, and then obviously you have one of the most successful sport podcasts out there. I've been an avid listener for literally since it came out, when you posted the first episode. And same thing with Doug, me and Doug, before when we were thinking about just bringing you on, we literally said, hey, we got to really talk like this guy. And Alex, he has a very successul podcast, and it's not only that; it's just the quality of what you bring onto that podcast,
and you as a person,
and exactly,
yeah.
you have different perspectives when you kind of gather that material on podcasts. You don't just stick to one thing and just talk about that. So
that means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And then, can you just talk a little about kind of in a broadened perspective, kind of what do you think are kind of the key necessities when it comes to filming or recording a podcast for it to become successful, or kind of what you see as a trend to kind of get more popularity in a podcast?
Yeah, I think, again, when I noticed the difference in terms of our audience was whenever we really improved the audio quality. And one thing I've saw too is, when we started the podcast, we basically said, let's not stick to a specific schedule. Let's just, because we have players coming on and executives coming on and they're super busy and have crazy schedules, we're just going to record whenever they're available and then post the episode right away. So that was kind of our strategy early on. And we've learned, okay, that doesn't work because, our audience isn't checking in every few hours to see if there's a new episode. You really have to stick to a specific posting schedule. That way people know, okay, on Monday morning and Thursday morning, which is our posting schedule now, there's going to be a new episode of the HoopsHype podcast that I can listen to. So we've really, that was something that we just added in the last few months here. And that's helped so much, being able to, it's almost like, scheduling a TV show. You want people to know when it's on so they go check for it and listen to it. So now, we'll do an interview with the player, but we may not post it until Monday morning. We'll wait a day or two just so that people know, okay, here's the new episode. So I think that's one of the biggest things. So just really audio quality. I would say you don't want it to be too long. Some podcasts can get away with it being 2 hours, 3 hours, but
we're not going there.
Yeah, that's a huge commitment for the host too. But one thing we've noticed is people just, I think they're intimidated by that. They're thinking, okay, that's 3 hours of my life, and where's the conversation going to really pick up and get good? They don't.
I think
really
maybe 90 max at most.
Right. And one thing that my bosses at HoopsHype, they've kind of said, let's stick to 45 minutes, and that's kind of the sweet spot we found. I think also when we're asking players to take time out of their busy schedule, it's tough to ask for more than 35, 40, 45 minutes. So that's kind of the spot that we've kind of figured out. And I think too, just getting good guests. There's going to be sometimes it's going to vary in terms of who we can get. There are times where we have crazy months where we have amazing guests, and there's going to be months where it's kind of, harder to find those guys, or they're really busy depending on time of year. But we try to get the best guests possible. I think that's a big thing too. Every time you have a guest, you bring in their audience and their fan base, and then if you can retain just a little portion of each guest and their followers, then I think you're gonna slowly grow over time. But yeah, I think just the posting schedule is the biggest advice that I could give to anyone starting a podcast. Making sure you post the same days, the same time, and people know when to check in. That's huge.
Yeah, that's spot on right there. I agree with every single one of the points you said. That's obviously, I've at least listened to a lot of podcasts, and I still do. And I've started to think about after you mentioned that point, a lot of these guys, a lot of podcasts, they kind of go with a familiar type of posting schedule. If it's not a Monday, they would kind of post that Tuesday or maybe a Sunday night and keep it in that same day or two gap.
Yeah.
And if not, they would kind of just wait, and then they would post something on Twitter to their audience. Hey, our episode will not be airing tonight. It will be airing on Tuesday at 6 p.m. or whatever the case is. So I agree with all your points there. And kind of let's just transition a little bit into kind of your perspective on some of your podcasts. And obviously, we don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but kind of who were some of your favorite athletes to interview or bring on on your podcast?
Oh man, I would say some of the ones that still blow me away that even happened were Kobe Bryant and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Ooh.
I mean, that I can't even believe that was my podcast.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, Kobe, we got really lucky. He followed me on Twitter out of nowhere, and I was kind of surprised. And then we started DMing back and forth. And I interviewed Kobe a few times when he was playing, but never one-on-one. We didn't really have a relationship, so that was really surprising for me. And then we just started talking, and I asked if he wanted to come on, and he said yes. So it really, really worked out. Retired Players Association about covering All-Star Weekend in Charlotte, and they were like, yeah, we're gonna have some players here. Would you want to do some interviews? And I was like, yeah, sure. And they sent me a list of players, and it was like 35, 40 players, and they basically said like, who from this list would you want?
Oh wow!
And I told them, I'll take any of these guys.
Like you're at the candy store, man.
And then when I get there that day, they were like, okay, here's your schedule. You're gonna have time with Kareem, Tim Hardaway Sr., Earl Monroe. I mean, just tons of talented guys. And Kareem was the nicest guy. I'd heard he can be grumpy and things like that, but he was fantastic. Had tons of great quotes, and it was so much fun. So those two really stood out just because I couldn't believe that we had a chance to sit down with them for 30 plus minutes. And then there have been guys, guys that I've been friendly with that came on, and guys like Kyle O'Quinn, who I've known since he was
Bar mitzvah man
in college. Yeah, he's just the funniest guy, and because we're close, it was less like an interview and more just like a funny conversation. So I always enjoy those ones too. But in terms of just like the big time guests, Kobe and Kareem, I mean, it's hard to beat those two.
Yeah, exactly. You hit it right there. And obviously, I got to say as well, my mentors and people I met around the field, they say the same thing. Obviously, when you talk to these guys, and I can't stress this enough to anyone that's listening, that's thinking about coming into this field or trying to gain something out of this that kind of revolves within kind of gaining kind of knowledge in this field. But everyone has told me, just pretend when you talk to these guys, you don't want to treat, they don't like to be treated as something more than what you are, but to a certain extent. So when one of the best advices I got was always talk to the guy like you're having a simple bar conversation,
right?
Or talk to them when you're like in a conversational tone or anything like that. And then kind of just to transition a little bit more into kind of today's NBA. I kind of just want to get your opinion on kind of just how the NBA landscape has shaped today after free agency, and kind of just get your opinion on that. Do you see any clear-cut 2020 NBA championship winner? Do you see any type of kind of favorites to come out of any conferences, or do you kind of just see how I see the league as kind of, it's wide open now? Obviously, there's 7-8 teams that can make a good run or be a surprising contender to win it all.
Yeah, I mean, I love free agency. I love player movement, like I mentioned before. So this past summer was amazing. I had so much fun, covering it, following it. I think it was great. I think it's great for the league too. You see so many fans. I think they're interested to see, okay, what's this team going to look like? And you never know if your team's going to land a star player in the next year or two. And I think you can say that for pretty much every team. And that's so much fun for fans. I think when I look at, favorites in each conference, I love what the Lakers and the Clippers did out west. I think it's hard to imagine, a team. I just feel like one of those teams is going to come out of the Western Conference. I
Flash of the
think.
Titans. LeBron said it best. Staples Center won free agency.
Yeah, no, really. I mean, it's incredible what those teams are able to do, and I mean, it helps that they're in LA. Obviously, that's a huge advantage. But I love those teams. I think they're going to be really good whenever they get acclimated and get to full strength. And then the Eastern Conference, I gotta say though, I know you guys cover the Nets, like the Nets. I really wish KD was playing this year. That team would be so much fun. I honestly could see them coming out of the East if they were healthy, but unfortunately, KD, I don't expect him to play this year. I don't want him to rush back. I hope he can just stay healthy for next year and then see what that team can do.
Totally agree.
When I look at the East right now without the Nets, obviously, I think, Milwaukee, it's just hard to stop Giannis. I think they really benefited from that experience last year in the playoffs. I did an interview with Brooke Lopez, and he was just talking about how, they were able to do that in year one with Mike Budenholzer and, trying to still get acclimated and learn on the fly, how to, play together and develop chemistry with more time. Obviously, they've had some changes to their roster, but with more time and with Giannis continuing to develop, I think they're going to be probably the team that represents the East in the finals. But I would
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I would say it's probably going to be Milwaukee. Then I think either the Lakers or Clippers are going to win it all.
I agree with that. And I got to ask you too, obviously you mentioned earlier in the podcast that you have an interest in the contract signings and the behind the scenes. And as of late, the NBA kind of has hinted and introduced a supermax that benefits a lot of small market teams. How do you do you think that supermax kind of will benefit those small market teams, or do you think that giving a player a supermax, and it takes up a lot of their cap space, but do you believe that was a good approach for the NBA to take with those small market teams?
I think they still need to figure out a way to help those small market teams because, they've been trying for a while. They try to help teams, I know, teams could extend players and then obviously they could pay them more. But I know it didn't make sense for guys to sign extensions. It made more sense for them to wait till free agency so they can make more money. So that blew up in the NBA space. You look at the Supermax, I think what it's going to do is end up hindering a lot of these small market teams because while maybe some of these big market teams can afford to have a bad contract and then build around it, and still keep winning, some of these small market teams, if they supermax the wrong guy and then they get injured, they're in a really difficult position. You look at John Wall with the Wizards. I mean, no one obviously could have predicted that he'd have, multiple injuries and be on the shelf for so long. But, he is making so much money over the next few years, and it really makes it hard to build a contender. So I think the NBA was trying to help small market teams and try to help teams, keep their star players. But at the end of the day, I don't know if that's going to be the mechanism that actually helps. I think it could actually hurt some teams. And I'm not sure, to be honest with you, as much as small market teams are wanting to keep their players, obviously, and keep their star players, I don't know the NBA has I don't think they have much incentive to stop the player movement because, again, I think it's amazing for league ratings and just, casual fan interest. Sure, there's going to be fans in smaller markets that are upset, but I think they love that every year or two you have these superstars that are changing teams. I really do think that benefits the NBA.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And while we're talking about contracts, money, obviously we got to take a little down step into the NCAA and obviously what they have done. Obviously, it was a time it had to come. It was bound to come with athletes getting paid, but getting paid off their name and kind of what they earned based on their kind of self promotion. But obviously, we've seen it with his players. Obviously, the Melo Ball is a different breed when it comes to why he chose overseas instead of college basketball. Because obviously he had a lot of ineligibility issues. But we see players like R.J. Hampton, for example, to go over and play in Australia. Super good guys in the past, like Brandon Jennings, a couple other guys that said, you know what, if I'm not going to be getting paid in college, and like when I was growing up. And this is what they kind of just have that mindset of, hey, when I grow up, I want to be an NBA player. I don't want to be just a college basketball player. So when all these players, they go overseas to make money and support their family, and then 1 year later they declare for the NBA draft, and they could say, hey, I played against grown men. I've averaged these numbers, and then obviously college basketball, it's never going to die no matter what kind of happens. But kind of how do you see the NCAA now kind of allowing players to kind of make money off their name and kind of self-promotion, everything? Do you think that was a A good move on the NCAA part. Obviously, at the end of the day, the NCAA it's a business. Obviously, they wanted to make money, and they wanted to make the most out of money based on that issue. But kind of just get your opinion on that and kind of that whole thing spiraled.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at these situations like the James Wiseman situation,
Exactly. Yep.
Chase Young, in college football. I think you look at the fan reaction, and fans for a long time now have been fed up that the NCAA and teams are making so much money off these players, but they're not seeing a penny of that. And you're going to see James Wiseman gets they want to rule him ineligible because someone helped him move. Penny Hardaway helped his family move. Chase Young wanted his girlfriend to come see him play the game, and the family member helped him out, and he paid the family member back, and they still want to sideline this guy. I mean, it's frustrating, and I think the NCAA they're going to have to pay players and change their model if they want to keep these top studs, because you mentioned RJ and LaMelo. You're going to see that happen more and more. Darius Baisley also did that. I spent a lot of time in the offseason at the different training sites like IMG Academy and Impact Basketball, and with the different trainers, and really, I was there this past summer. Kenyon Martin Jr., Kenyon Martin's son, is going through the whole process right now where he decided not to play college basketball, and he's either going to play in the G League or I forget what he's going to do. He was weighing different options, G League, overseas basketball, just training for a year, entering the draft. He was looking at those different options, but he chose to go pro over playing in college, and he wasn't even a guy that was a big superstar. So you're going to see that more and more where even some of these, guys that aren't first round projected guys, they're going to look at going overseas and making some money. So I think it's going to become a much more popular path for these guys. I think overseas teams, they're going to adapt and realize, hey, if we put together the right kind of offer and the right kind of system for these guys, the right kind of adjustment process where they can come over and prepare for the NBA, they're going to get some really talented players, and not only that, but a lot of fan interest. It's great for them. Let's say there was an overseas team that put together the right, situation for some of these guys that could attract top prospects. Can you imagine if like a Zion Williamson had went overseas, what that would do for one of these overseas teams? Their fans they'd have fans at every single game. They'd have a great TV deal. There'd be interest from the States as well as overseas. These overseas teams, they're very smart. I know a long time ago, guys like Brandon Jennings, the idea was, okay, we don't play young guys when he was overseas. But, if the players are talented enough and NBA ready enough, let's say, or overseas ready enough, I guess, you're going to see teams take advantage of that and try to attract these top talents. So the NCAA almost has to make a change, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And then kind of just based off that same point is kind of, do you see, obviously with the NCAA now kind of establishing that rule, do you see now players kind of in high school, do you expect more players to kind of follow that trend that RJ Hampton, LaMelo Ball are doing, kind of going to the NBL, a rising basketball league, where obviously a lot of NBA veterans like Andrew Bogut and others have played in? Do you see that kind of becoming more of a trend, or do you kind of seeing that being on a personalized note of players saying, you know what, I think I could build my draft status or my draft stock better by going overseas rather than playing college basketball?
Well, I think, it's going to take those guys playing well overseas and then getting drafted high enough for others to want to follow that path. I think
Exactly. Yeah.
You had Darius Baisley, he went a little bit later in the draft. It's not like he was a top pick. So I think you're going to see, RJ Hampton could be, a very, very high pick in this draft. And that's where, if one of those guys is able to do it, and LaMelo too, LaMelo has had such a unique journey, but I think players are going to look at that. And right now, I think with so many of these guys, they just focus on college, and a few of them will consider it. In the future, though, if guys like RJ and LaMelo, are able to have success over there, it's going to be something where almost every top prospect has to come out and consider, okay, what are my options, and consider that just as seriously as they consider going to college. So I do think it really depends on these guys, and if they're able to really show, hey, this path really works, and especially too, if they're able to develop their bodies and really benefit from the experience of playing against grown men, then I think you're going to see, okay, teams are taking it seriously. You can help your draft stock over there. It's not like you're out of sight, out of mind. Like, back in the day, that was kind of the excuse that a lot of players would make for not considering that. If that changes, you're going to see so many guys consider that.
Totally agree on that. But Doug, you have any questions on top of your mind?
Yeah, so I know we lightly talked about in last pod and it kind of got brought up back again with LeBron. So what about load management? At what age do you think it's appropriate? Because LeBron has a good point, and I know our friends over at Ain't Hard to Tell podcast talked about it as well. When is it the right? Because a lot of times when you're a young athlete growing up, sometimes you throw your body away. I'm not sorry, that's taking sounds a lot worse than it is, but you throw your body away per se at an early age, and then it comes back to haunt you quicker.
Yeah, I did an interview, or I did a recent article where I talked about, I know Earl Watson tweeted out that load management is the toll of youth basketball and AAU basketball in addition to the NBA schedule. And he was saying, there's a problem that needs to be addressed. These kids are playing, 13 to 15 games per weekend. And like you said, they're really putting a lot of wear and tear on their body at such a young age. So I took that concept and I talked to a number of NBA players about it and kind of got their opinions. I talked to Zach LaVine, Miles Turner, Nick Vucevic, Keon Dooling, a bunch of guys. And basically, Zach LaVine said, yeah, it was too much. We played too much basketball growing up. He said he would sometimes play 3 to 4 games per day. And he thinks that a lot of times, the knee issues that guys end up having is a result of the wear and tear they had in AAU. Miles Turner said that, in the moment, you don't think you're playing a lot. You're a kid. You want to be on the court because you want the college coaches and the scouts to see you. So you're not even thinking about it. But then he's like, looking back, it was a grind and it did have a toll on us. So I think you almost have to protect these kids from themselves because they want to play and they don't see a problem. But then later on in life, when, they have, experience and they can think about the long-term consequences, they look back and think, wow, I really shouldn't have done it to my body. So especially too, I went on Eaton Thomas's radio show and he was talking about this and said basically, he coaches his son's AAU team and there are kids that jump around and play with 3 different AAU teams. So it's almost, even if you try to limit one team schedule, these kids find a loophole and try to find every opportunity they can to play for these coaches and show what they can do and help their stock. So it's really an issue. I think they need to do something with youth basketball. And, everyone talks about, the old players from an older era saying, why do they need load management? We played this and that, and we had not only back-to-backs, but we played 3 games in a row. Well, the biggest difference is that those guys weren't playing AAU and playing 15 games in a weekend. So I think you can kind of point to that and see, it adds to the conversation at least, and people can at least understand why some of these players are doing that. One big thing, too, that we've talked about in that article was there's been studies that show that players that play one sport versus multiple sports are more likely to have injury issues, overuse injury issues. Baxter Holmes of ESPN wrote a great article about this. But, one study showed that players that only play one sport are 125% more likely to have overuse injuries. So they're, ligaments, bones, and cartilage.
That makes a lot of sense because when you go into the gym, there's a reason why they call leg day and, upper body. So
yeah, you're putting so much wear and tear on, your knees and things like that, rather than, after a season ends, you go play a different sport that uses different muscles and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, they said that shift started happening in the early 2000s, that, a lot of these kids went from playing sports as a hobby or, looking at different sports and kind of just having fun with it to saying, okay, I want to be a professional basketball player, or I need to play one sport and get as good as possible to get a scholarship. And you're seeing way more injuries at a young age. A lot of parents push their kids into one sport. I think a lot of, high school coaches, they are trying to persuade kids to play one sport too. It's, if you take this seriously, then you'll quit your other sports, or, sometimes the sports overlap. You see football season and basketball season overlap a little bit, which didn't used to be the case. So you almost have to pick, and it's just causing more problems. So, you see, I think the junior NBA, they do a great job. They're trying to persuade kids to play multiple sports and limit the number of games. So I think a lot of people, we need to see AAU and youth basketball kind of follow in their footsteps.
Exactly. You hit it spot on.
And we'll definitely look back at this in a few years and see how it's progressed. So I don't know if Chris has some more things to ask, but I have one last thing that I was kind of interested in because you're such big on movement. What do you think is going to happen by February? What kind of things do you want to predict? Obviously, it doesn't have to be right, but I'm curious. Someone who loves following this kind of trend, what kind do you think we'll see this year?
Well, it's interesting. You talk to executives. They think it's going to be a really boring deadline, to be honest with you. I know it's not the answer you want, but after
it's fine.
After such a crazy offseason with free agency, they're basically saying, look, the deadline's going to be pretty boring, and then next year in free agency is going to be pretty boring too, because so many of these guys just signed new contracts. So you look at next year's free
Really,
agency.
even with the Knicks' crazy flexibility, they own the power forward market, man.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, you look at the free agent class next year, and it's pretty weak. I think most teams are kind of gearing up for 2021 just because there's not really any stars next summer. So that's kind of one of the downsides of having such a crazy summer, where basically every star that was available gets traded, and then every big superstar free agent signs a multi-year deal. Next summer is going to be kind of boring.
So pretty much what you're saying is the year 2020, we're actually not going to see anything.
Potentially. I mean, unless Anthony Davis shocks everyone. I know there was Laker fans freaking out about his comment about the Bulls and, Chicago's an option. I know that scared a lot of people.
Shut that down last pod as well.
Right. He walked it back. So, I mean, I unless that happens, you're looking at some young players that are going to be free agents, but no real superstars. So, I don't know. I mean, I do think at the deadline, there's been some play, Bradley Beal was someone that was mentioned, but then he signed his extension. Kevin Love has been mentioned as a possibility from executives, but then that contract is so brutal. I know they wanted to sign to extension because LeBron and Kyrie had just left and everything, but there are some teams that are scared of that contract too. So I think you can see, some minor tinkering at the deadline. That's one of the good things about having this kind of parity. When you have so many teams that are feeling like they have a chance to win it all this year, they may try to go all in and, trade a pick or a young player for a win now piece. So you may see something like that, and that may be the bulk of the moves. But in terms of like a really big name moving, we saw most of them last summer, unfortunately.
Yeah, and then Alex, I have one last question for you as well. Is kind of on a different topic, and we touched on it a little bit. The NBA G League, obviously, from when it was the D League, a lot of people kind of viewed it as, even today, now being named the G League, everyone kind of just still views it as the minor leagues of the NBA. There's not too much importance behind it. These are just players that can't find that roster spot on an NBA team. But obviously, from covering the Long Island Nets, what I do for Nets Daily for my second year now, I and talking to a lot of like other teams, other players, the NBA G League is obviously it's rising. It's a rising league, and obviously talent is there, and obviously, like you mentioned before, and we have talked about it, a lot of high school players are now looking into that avenue to kind of get that direct way and make the $35,000 right out of high school. But can you kind of just talk about, in your own opinion, kind of how you see the NBA G League kind of unloading and kind of transforming and translating into years to come?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they've done a good job of raising the salary. I did an article about life in the G League. That was one of the ones I did about a year ago. And I talked to people that one of the head coaches in the G League, or former head coaches, Cody Topper. He's now at the University of Memphis, but he was a former player in the G League. And he talked about how when he was playing, he was making $10,000 for the entire season.
Oh.
So, I mean, it used to be really bad. I know players, they look at today's salary and they still think it's way too low. And I understand that. I totally agree, especially when you look at overseas salaries. Some of these guys have to decide, okay, do I want to be in the G League and be able to get called up, or do I want to go overseas for a year and make that money and then have that money in the bank, which makes it a little bit easier to chase that dream. Some of these guys go overseas for a year, then decide to play in the G League because they have that financial security. So I think raising the salary, continuing to do that, I think that's going to be important if they want to attract, more talent. I do think getting these college kids or these high school kids that skip college, that's going to be huge. I think at the end of the day, they need to drum up the kind of interest so people want to tune in to a G League game, because right now you don't really have that. I think another way that could really, change is if you have teams start to use it a little bit more for not only development, but also injury rehab stints. We've seen that with practices a bit. I think Victor Oladipo was just signed to Indiana's affiliate for practice and everything, so he can
That's great
work
news.
out with them. Yeah, I mean, I think if we see that more often, where teams will say, okay, you're coming back from your injury, kind of like baseball with their minor league system, where guys coming back from injury, so you go play a G League game to kind of get your feet under you. That way, when you play in the first NBA game, you kind of feel more confident. You've been out there already. That would help as well.
And it's great for fans.
Yeah, exactly. It's great for fans. I mean, I think every minor league game I've ever been to growing up, my dad would say, hey, this guy's going to actually play tonight, and it's a star player. Or, we grew up in, again, I'm in Florida here. So, we had the Yankees minor league team and a number of minor league teams, the Detroit Tigers. So he would say, hey, this MLB player is going to be playing. Let's go watch this game. So we go buy tickets to a game. So, I mean, it would get people interested in G League results. And I know, I think they want to get fans interested in the teams in general every day too. But, part of that happens by just having people tune in for one game. If they watch, Victor Oladipo play with the Pacers G League affiliate, they may like what they see and tune back in. So I think that could be huge for them as well.
Exactly. Well, Alex, thank you again for joining me and Doug. We both really appreciate you coming on and talking almost everything NBA from G League to your personal life and then the NBA today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure.
And one last thing is obviously our viewers probably know a lot about you, but you want to just give a brief description of where they could find you. Kind of, we talked a little about in the intro that I did, kind of what the work you've done, but kind of give yourself a shout out, like where they could find you and kind of the work that you do, and kind of just a free shout out on your part.
For sure, yeah. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex Kennedy NBA. You can read my work on HoopsHype. You can listen to the HoopsHype podcast, which posts every Monday and Thursday morning. And then you can find my work also at USA Today Sports, different videos and things like that there. So yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys. I really appreciate it. This was fun.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. And then Doug, you got any closing remarks for us?
Oh, I do indeed. So remember, guys, feel free to email over any suggestions, questions, comments, or thoughts of our content by sending an email to wingspanpodcast@gmail.com. And do not forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and forget to subscribe to our podcast as well on your preferred listening devices. As for next time, stay classy, take care, and have a great day.
Yay!